Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager. The employment report for May. It is expected to add new evidence of a gradually cooling labor market. Forecasters project employers boosted payrolls last month by 180,000. Let's get a preview now from Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
The nation's labor market takes on added import as the Fed gets ready for next week's policy meeting. While it would take a major surprise for the May jobs report to influence a rate change, today's data will help set the scenario for a future move. After months of almost entirely focusing on inflation, Fed officials say they're now almost as focused on employment. Anything close to consensus will leave central bankers and investors parsing the difference between the slowdown expected and an as-yet unexpected recession. Should the labor market show signs of significant weakening, it could mean rate cuts come earlier. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Mike, thanks. Two big Wall Street banks are sticking with that bet for earlier Fed rate cuts. JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup still are predicting that the Federal Reserve will begin to ease next month. Traders have all but ruled out a July cut. They did that back in April. Now expect rates to hold steady until November. But the case for earlier cuts has strengthened in recent days. It's helped to drive the longest streak of global bond gains since November. As for equities, meme stock mania is gripping Wall Street once again. We are watching shares of GameStop in the pre-market. They are soaring by nearly 34%. Let's get more on why from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
The reason behind the rally is once again Keith Gill. His Roaring Kitty online moniker sent GameStop surging recently. Now he says he plans to return to YouTube for the first time in 3 years. His anticipated return is sparking further speculation that Gill is bullish on GameStop. Within minutes of the posting, more than 10,000 YouTube users signaled an interest in being notified when the stream starts. The latest surge adds to Gill's haul from positions disclosed on his Reddit account. His stake of 120,000 call options at $20, expiring in 2 weeks, is now worth some $325 million. That would give him an unrealized profit of about $260 million. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Jeff, thank you. Now let's turn to politics. President Biden heads back to Normandy, France today, where he'll give a speech defending democracy from Pointe du Hoc. That's the spot where Army Rangers scaled the cliffs during D-Day. But the president has matters back home in mind as well. He gave an interview to David Muir on ABC's World News Tonight. And David asked the president about the federal gun case against his son Hunter.
Let me ask you, will you accept the jury's outcome, their verdict, no matter what it is?
Yes.
And have you ruled out a pardon for your son?
Yes.
President Biden also talked about his push for a ceasefire in Gaza. He says his announcement last week, billed as an Israeli proposal, has had an impact on the ground.
They were going to go into Rafah full bore, invade all of Rafah, go into the city, take it out, move with full force. They haven't done that. And what they've done is they've agreed to a significant agreement that if, in fact, Hamas accepts it.
Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said there can be no permanent ceasefire until Hamas is destroyed. But President Biden says he still thinks Netanyahu backs his plan. And we will hear more from the Israeli Prime Minister in Washington next month. He's accepted an invitation to address both houses of Congress. And we get the details on that from Bloomberg's Steve Potusk in the nation's
House Speaker
capital.
Mike Johnson's office announced that Netanyahu will address a joint meeting of the House and Senate on July 24th. Netanyahu is facing intense criticism over the civilian death toll in the war in Gaza, which has caused divisions among lawmakers and led to public disagreements with President Joe Biden. Some Democrats, including Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, have said they would boycott the address. This would be Netanyahu's fourth speech to a joint meeting of Congress. That would make him the first foreign leader to do so that many times. In Washington, Steve Potusk, Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Steve, thank you. And as the war in Gaza rages on, the U.S. continues to show support for Ukraine. Officials say the U.S. will send about $225 million in military aid to the country. President Biden used his speech on the 80th anniversary of D-Day to vow the U.S. will not walk away from the defense of Ukraine and allow Russia to threaten more of Europe. Biden plans to meet with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris later today. As for former President Donald Trump, investors are weighing the potential impact if he wins this November's election. Trump donors are cheering the prospect of a fresh round of tax cuts next year, but that could have a fiscal impact. The Congressional Budget Office estimates it would cost $4.6 trillion over a decade if portions of the 2017 tax cut package were extended. It's not dampening Republican enthusiasm for the prospect, though. Many simply reject those cost projections, asserting tax cuts pay for themselves through economic gains. Turning to commodities, we're checking gold this morning, and it is lower by 1.2%. That's after China's central bank disclosed it did not buy any gold last month. It ends a massive buying spree that had run for 18 months after the precious metal surged to a record high. And stocks in India are up 2%. The country's main index has recouped most of its losses following the election results. Earlier this week, the Indian stock market erased about $386 billion in value as Prime Minister Narendra Modi's ruling party struggled to win a majority of seats in national elections. Now let's look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world with Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Happy Friday morning, Michael.
And happy Friday to you, Nathan. Prosecutors on New York's Long Island have charged 60-year-old serial killer suspect Rex Heuermann with 2 more counts of murder. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney talked about one of the victims, Jessica Taylor, back in 2003. Tierney says Heuermann was ultimately tied to Taylor's killing after a hair found on the skull at Gill Beach was DNA tested.
The defendant could not be excluded as the donor of that hair, and it's 1.837 times 10 to the 603rd power more likely that it came to that it matched the defendant or someone matching the defendant's DNA profile than a member of the population at large.
District Attorney Tierney says the other murdered victim was Sandra Castilla, killed back in 1993. Several hundred airport workers from John F. Kennedy Airport and LaGuardia Airport joined together at JFK to rally to improve working conditions at New York City airports. The contract for the more than 10,000 airport service workers, including baggage handlers, wheelchair attendants, and cleaners, is set to expire on June 30th. Queensborough Union President Donovan Richards spoke at the rally, standing with the workers.
And it is unions who built this borough, it is unions who built this city, and it is unions who run our airports.
Union President Donovan Richards says they're asking management for a raise in minimum wage for employees to $25 per hour by 2030, improved health care benefits, and additional paid leave. Former Trump White House aide Steve Bannon has been ordered to turn himself in to a federal prison starting July 1st. Bannon refused to comply with the subpoena issued by the House January 6th committee. The former White House aide was convicted of contempt of Congress and sentenced to 4 months in prison. Outside the courthouse, Bannon said this will not stop him from speaking out about what he says is an unfair Justice Department.
There's not a prison built or a jail built that will ever shut me up.
A 3-judge appellate panel last month rejected an earlier ruling from a judge who presided over Bannon's case and said that he could stay out while his appeal was pending. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg Nathan.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here is John Stashower.
All right, Nathan, the Celtics went through the first 3 rounds of the NBA playoffs, only losing twice, and most of that without Kristaps Porzingis, the ex-Knick, who averaged 20 points a game in the regular season. He returned from a leg injury in Boston for Game 1 of the NBA Finals against Dallas, and Porzingis was immediately hitting shots, blocking shots. The Celtics led the Mavs by 17 in the first quarter and by 29 in the second. They won the series opener 107-89. Porzingis finished with 20 points. Jaylen Brown had 22. Jason Tatum scored 16. He had 11 rebounds and 5 assists.
We played well tonight, so a lot of things we feel like we could do better. But it definitely does feel good to win the first game. But we know that 2 years ago, we won the first game and, the outcome of that series. So we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, lost that series to Golden State. They'll play Game 2 in Boston on Sunday. A potentially big NBA story that started brewing yesterday morning with the ESPN report that the Lakers are targeting UConn's Dan Hurley as their next coach. Two sides will reportedly meet today. At the stadium, another Yankee win of the Twins. This one 8-5. They led 7-2, held on for their 8th win in a row, 19th in the last 23 games. They went 6-0 versus Minnesota. And now here come the Dodgers to town for a star-studded, hyped-up weekend series, though we'll see if Juan Soto can play. He left last night's game feeling discomfort in his left arm. Mets are in London, where they'll play the Phillies tomorrow and Sunday. Red Sox are in Chicago. The White Sox have lost 14 games in a row. Boston won last night, 14-2. Should be a good French Open semifinal this morning when Yannick Sinner meets Carlos Alcaraz, the 2 and 3 seeds. Casper Ruud then takes on Sasha Zverev. Iga Swiatek will be a prohibitive favorite in tomorrow's women's final. She's won 20 straight matches in Paris. She'll take on the Italian Jasmine Paolini. John Stashauer, Bloomberg Sports.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager. President Biden is set to meet later today with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris. Before that, though, the president will speak on defending democracy from the cliffs where Army Rangers scaled on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, the same cliffs where then-President Ronald Reagan gave one of his most famous speeches 40 years ago. For more on the geopolitics, we are joined now by Bloomberg News senior editor Bill Ferries. Bill, good morning. This theme of defending democracy has really pervaded the president's trip to France so far this year. What are you going to be watching for on this second day of the president's visit to Normandy and to Paris?
Well, we're looking, as you said, they have really, the President Biden and even some allies, French President Macron, have really linked this 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion to the situation going on in Ukraine, saying that, 80 years ago, the U.S. and its allies were fighting tyranny on the European continent. And that's they want to remind people that that's how they view the situation in Ukraine right now. We do have reports coming out now in terms of the Ukraine part of the equation that the U.S. is getting ready to, the president is getting ready to approve another $225 million in military aid to Ukraine. This is from his presidential drawdown authority. So these are weapons that are already in stores and warehouses ready to go out. It's a lot of the ammunition that we saw Ukraine lacking in the months while the U.S. Congress was debating whether to provide more aid. And it includes some of that artillery for the HIMARS systems, which can strike into Russian territory. And that's something the U.S. has just only recently given its approval for. So we're going to try to see if there's more coming from the U.S. side. And we also have a report that the French President Macron is also planning to send fighter jets to Ukraine. It will take a few months to get Ukrainian pilots trained on those systems, but those allies all promising fresh weapons for their ally in Kyiv.
Yeah, really interesting to see how the tide has sort of turned even over just the last several months about the level of support, the level of offensive support that the U.S. and its allies are willing to give Ukraine right now. Where would you put the level of support for Ukraine at this point when presumably a lot of voters, a lot of citizens in many of these countries might be feeling a bit of war fatigue at the moment?
Yeah, it's, from the heads of state, from the governments, it's high. The level of support is high. You remember when the U.S. Congress passed this package, the goal was really to provide a full year's worth of funding for Ukraine so that the White House would not have to go back to Congress asking for more money. It took, about just about 6 months for the White House to get that package through Congress when you count up all the delays. So they know how hard that experience was, and they want to try to avoid that. And of course, you have the U.S. election looming in November, and a lot of Republicans in particular, but some Democrats as well, don't want to see a lot more U.S. taxpayer money flowing to Ukraine. They'd rather see that kept at home. So there's a big question mark hanging over what that support level will look like after the November election.
And hanging over all of this as well is the ongoing war in Gaza and President Biden continuing to push for a ceasefire there while we're waiting for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to give an address to Congress late next month. That could be an overhang for quite some time, Bill.
Yeah, Prime Minister Netanyahu scheduled to speak to Congress, a joint session of Congress on July 24th. So, roughly, let's say 7 weeks from now, big question mark in terms of what that conflict in Gaza will look like. They've been trying to get a breakthrough on this proposal for a ceasefire for more than 2 months now. So entirely possible that when Netanyahu comes to the U.S., there could have been a ceasefire. They could still be trying to negotiate one. We really don't know what status the war will be at, but certainly, a political message being sent as well by Republicans in particular, inviting the prime minister to come. There's been a lot of tensions between Netanyahu and President Biden and his administration. It will be very interesting to see what the status of that relationship is come in July.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond. You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco. Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager. Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.